Welcome to the second Future Work and Disability webinar in the We Count Digging Deeper series. So I think all of you can see that the captions are available today, and we have ASL interpretation available for those who would also like to use it. I'd like to begin with our land acknowledgement. OCAD University acknowledges the ancestral and traditional territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat, who are the original owners and custodians of the land on which we stand and create. I'd also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. Hello everyone, I'm Vera Roberts. I work at the Inclusive Design Research Center, and I have the honor of moderating today's session. So welcome again. I'm going to just tell you about our agenda. So today we'll be we'll have presentations from our panelists, followed by discussion, and then we'll have opportunity to have questions from the audience. Now I'd like to take a moment to introduce our guest speakers. We're very fortunate today to have Alexandra Reeve-Givens and Julia Stoyanovich with us. Alexandra is the CEO of the Center for Democracy and Technology. It's a think tank that focuses on protecting democracy, individual rights in the digital age through policy. In her spare time, Alexandra serves on the board of the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation. She's also a mayoral appointee on the Washington, D.C.'s Innovation and Technology Inclusion Council. Julia is an assistant professor of computer science and engineering and of data science at New York University. And she researches responsible data management and analysis. She ensures that fairness, diversity, transparency, and data protection in all stages of the data science lifecycle through her research. She is the founding director of the Center for Responsible AI at New York University. This is a comprehensive laboratory that is building a future in which responsible AI will be the only kind accepted by society. Thank you for joining us today. Alexandra, I'm going to let you begin with your presentation.
Wonderful. Hello, everybody. And it's very nice to join you from down here in Washington, D.C. I'm going to share my screen because I have some slides. They were shared ahead of time. For those of you who are not able to see the slides directly, know that the content is going to exactly be reflected in my words, so you can follow along that way if you would like to. So I'm going to talk today about two areas that focus kind of two particular pieces of this question about a bias in the selection of candidates. And my focus is going to be on what some of the legal frameworks are, what some potential avenues of argument are against bias, and then the types of conduct that we at my organization are pushing companies to think about when they engage on these issues, and tools that we hope advocates will have. I'm going to start by doing a quick overview of some of the types of tools that we are talking about to help ground the conversation. Some of these may well be very familiar to those of you in the working group, but just in case, I think it's useful to pause and talk about some of the tools being used and some of the concerns that they raise. So one of the classic examples of the use of AI in hiring is the use of resume screening. Tools that help sort vast stacks of resumes into smaller amounts that may be tailored to a particular job description. The types of concerns that we may be aware of here from a disability and general inclusion perspective is that the tools are often trained to look for traits or characteristics in an existing employee pool. And we can think about the risks of that perpetuating existing patterns of inequality in a workforce. One famous example was a tech company that used one of these tools for their internal hiring processes and ended up realizing that the samples of people coming through were skewing overwhelmingly towards men. The reason was the algorithm had been trained on the resumes of successful existing employees, which had really poor gender representation within them. From a disability perspective, we can think about gaps in a person's resume, where they may have gone to a place of higher education, participation on a sports team, you can name it, kind of all the different types of traits that might be inadvertently being factored into the screening here, and how that can end up disadvantaging people whose resumes may differ from those within the established selection pool. Another example of a tool is the use of video interviews that then purport to conduct sentiment analysis or facial recognition analysis on a person's conduct during that interview. And another example is the increasing use of games and logic tests in hiring tools. There's a sample up here on the slide for those of you who are able to see it. Here we have, for example, a test for numerical and logical reasoning, which invites the candidate to click on an image which says which side of these two images has the larger proportion of yellow dots. And what they're measuring there is the speed and the accuracy of your return of that answer. Obviously, that's a very specific example. You can imagine if somebody is colorblind, choosing the number of dots of a particular color on a screen may be troubling. If you think of somebody with a mobility impairment, speed of response time being seen as a gauge of your intelligence or your quickness in response is actually not a fair or accurate measure of your abilities. On the right side of this slide, we see some examples that describe what this tool is purporting to measure, or what some of the games in this particular company are purporting to measure. The factors include things like attention, effort, fairness, decision-making, focus, generosity. Some of those too, we can worry about being coded words or measures that will have a significant disadvantage for people that present with a particular disability. I'm happy to talk more about these in the Q&A. We are always working to surface examples of these types of tools and the potential exclusionary effects that they may have, even exclusionary effects that are not remotely intended by the designers, but may well end up having those consequences for people that are being measured through these tools. So what does the legal framework have to say about some of these? The good news is that the law does actually say quite a bit. I am pulling up here text of some key arguments in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm going to jump right to that, even though many analyses also look at Title VII in the United States, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, and ethnicity. Within the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's actually some very clear and specific language that raises very real concerns about the legality of some of these tests and the potential discriminatory effects. The ADA requires that testing formats be accessible. We need to make sure that candidates can request reasonable accommodations. So that is one clear angle here. The test that I began showing, which had the discerning for color dots, for example, an employer would need to be able to make a reasonable accommodation offer to somebody that is unable to interface with the testing format. But then the ADA says more. It has very useful language about prohibiting discrimination, including the prohibition of employment tests that screen out or tend to screen out a person with a disability. Excuse me, I've clicked out by accident. One of the obligations on employers is that they may be liable if they fail to select and administer employment tests in the most effective manner to ensure that tests accurately reflect the skills that they purport to measure, rather than reflecting an applicant's or an employee's impairment. So there, what the law is getting at is saying, is this test actually measuring what it is trying to measure, the skills that are required for this job, as opposed to evaluating somebody's ability or disability. Another legal argument under the Americans with Disabilities Act is that there's a prohibition on pre-employment medical examinations. This comes up in settings, not exactly the test that I showed you in my opening remarks, but in other settings where there's an increasing use of personality quizzes and personality tests. And there's actually been some good case law established that if the test draws on, for example, psychiatric evaluation measures, if it's administered by a psychologist, it crosses the line from being a hiring tool to being a medical examination that's prohibited under the ADA. So the good news is that there is some pretty strong language. The bad news is it's very hard to bring these claims. They rely on individuals knowing that they were the victims of discrimination, knowing how they were screened out, and then being able to effectively prosecute their rights. And as we know, that can be enormously challenging. So one of the things that we are very focused on is not only educating people about their rights, but then also going directly to employers so that they are thinking about the risks of exclusion preemptively and taking conscious affirmative steps to avoid them. We recently partnered with a group of over 20 civil rights organizations in the United States to publish the Civil Rights Principles for Hiring Assessment Technologies. And this is intended as a tool for both policymakers, advocates, and employers to know about the potential vectors of discrimination and take conscious steps to be able to address them. Some of the things that we emphasize in that is, first of all, a principle of non-discrimination, which should run through all of these tools. But the second one was a really important point for me and for my colleagues as disability advocates, this focus on job relatedness. Here, what we are worried about is the overwhelming tendency, a very common habit amongst employers, to think of tests and not actually go through that rigorous exercise of figuring out whether what they are assessing is essential for the job in question. That's actually a requirement under the Americans with Disabilities Act, as I mentioned, but it's a very easy step to overlook, particularly when you're being sold a product off the shelf that purports to help you screen through candidates. What we are saying is that an essential principle needs to be that check of saying, well, what are the attributes that are actually required to do the job in question? How do I measure somebody's ability to perform those particular skills required and nothing else? So that's an essential piece that we are pushing for very strongly. The third is this goal of notice and explanation. So if somebody doesn't know what they are being evaluated for or how they are being evaluated, it may actually be very hard for them to know whether their disability may adversely affect how they do in that test. And then it may also be hard for the employer to know. So for example, if you think about an employment test that is purporting to analyze how somebody presents on a video, lack of eye contact may well have a significant impact on somebody's success or failure under that metric. But an autistic person may not know that they need to ask for an accommodation or to flag that disability as a reason why they should have an alternative mode of testing. So the notice piece here is essential. Again, I should pause to say, I have fundamental concerns with the testing technology to begin with. So this is not to imply that I support that as a valid method of measuring someone's effectiveness. But if we are going down the path of an employer knowing this tool, they need to very accurately and fully and fairly describe the process that they are using so that employees know how they may be affected in the course of that engagement. A fourth principle that we are pushing for is rigorous auditing. So it is very hard for people to know whether or not their platforms are discriminating against people, if they're having an adverse impact on particular groups, without rigorous and frequent checks of how people are doing and how they are coming through. For reasons I'll talk about in a minute, I actually think that auditing is very hard in the disability context, but nevertheless, it's an essential principle that we need employers to be frequently checking and looking at the impact of the tools they are trying to use. And then the last point, number 5, is about oversight and accountability. And here is the notion that we have to have employers understand their legal obligations, their ethical and moral obligations, if they are considering using these types of tools. And we need real oversight and accountability from lawmakers and from regulatory agencies as well. In the United States, one area of focus is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Another is looking at how federal contractors, which are a large percentage of the US employer base, are using these tools and what accountability we can insist for there. And then the third is thinking about how the Hill, so how legislators on Capitol Hill are engaging on these topics as well. There was recently in the United States a bill introduced called the Algorithmic Accountability Act. And what it mandates is that anybody using an algorithmic decision system has to audit for potential bias, and if they uncover it, have to take proactive steps to mitigate that bias. What's interesting about that regulatory approach is that it doesn't say exactly what the answer is. It doesn't say come down exactly on whether or not these tools should be used, but it says that if you are making that choice, you need to have a certified impact assessment methodology that accompanies the use of that tool. So that's an important piece of the puzzle as well. When I think about how to kind of where the points of intervention are, a lot of my work at the Center for Democracy and Technology is focusing, as I mentioned, on empowering advocates to know what potential areas of concern are, help raise general public awareness. But there's also a lot of pressure to be put, as I said, on employers, on their in-house counsel. So we are spending a lot of time talking to people at the American Bar Association and to other lawyers about what legal vulnerabilities look like in this space. And then the third piece is thinking about how employers can be empowered to put pressure on vendors and to ask the right questions of vendors that are generating these tools. As I mentioned earlier in my remarks, it can sometimes be tempting to take a product off the shelf and to not think specifically about whether or not it's right to use that product, how it should be tailored for your organization, whether it's asking the right questions and actually screening for the things that matter for the role you're trying to fill. And so we want to empower employers and other decision makers to be much smarter, more informed consumers of these products and make sure that they are really engaging in that self-examination as to whether or not they are appropriate for use. And if they do use them, how to mitigate against potential concerns. If you'll indulge me, I'll spend one more minute just talking about some of the challenges in this space, and then I would love to pass it over to Julia and then to our broader discussion. On the challenges piece, there are a couple specific areas that come up in the disability space in particular when we're thinking about the use of AI tools in hiring or in the workforce. One is that even if a company, a vendor of these types of products, is aware of the concerns, aware of the potential bias, fixing that at the design phase is actually quite challenging. Some of them are doing thoughtful outreach to groups to think about how we get more voices at the table, to think about potential negative consequences of these tools. But one of the challenges, and Julia may well talk about this, is that these tools train. The way that AI learns is by taking an existing body of data, studying the patterns within it, and from that making inferences to inform decisions in the future. The sheer variety of ways in which disabilities may present, the sheer range of disabilities, coupled with the challenge of getting data about people's disability, because many of us feel very concerned about sharing that publicly, let alone in a database that's used to train algorithms. The lack of training data makes it very hard for people that are trying to have their tools understand the full range in which a person's abilities may present during the course of an interview. And then a separate piece, which may well actually just undermine the validity of these tools in general, is that when you think about basing decisions on someone's suitability for a job based on trends you have seen in the existing workforce or in a selected training data set, by definition, what you're doing is making assumptions, drawing from a general crowd as to what that means for a specific person. And that's exactly what our civil rights laws and the disability rights movement has been fighting to stop for decades. That a lot of those decisions and inferences are based on stereotypes and assumptions about people's general abilities, as opposed to a decision that is based on somebody's specific consideration of the individual candidate in front of you. So I think that's a critical element that we need to think about when we are looking at the use of AI in hiring and thinking about the disability lens in particular. My next point is a little technical, but I hope you'll come on this journey with me, which are the limitations of auditing for bias on the basis of disability. So some people in the AI space, when we talk about the concerns of bias in hiring, say, well, one of the ways to mitigate this is to come in and do statistical auditing to see how people are doing in this test and see if we're inadvertently screening out women at a higher rate than men, for example. That's not just a scientific approach. It actually is endorsed by the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which has on the books in its guidance on employee selection procedures, which date from 1978, an idea that the best way to look for discrimination is to do a statistical analysis and follow what they call the 4/5 rule, which is that if a group is being screened out at 4/5 the rate of the dominant group, so if women are being screened out at a rate of 8 or making it through at a rate of only 80% how men are making it through, that's a good indicia that there is something discriminatory happening in your tool and need to go back and reevaluate it. That model, that idea that you can screen for bias in a statistical way and then go in and use that to fix a tool is very dominant amongst the vendor community of AI hiring tools right now. And for many of them, they do follow that approach. And as a result, they then market their tools as being audited for bias and something that companies can comfortably use without concern. The problem is that type of statistical auditing for bias is enormously hard when you think about disability. What data set would you be running through that in any statistical way would show how people are being screened out versus non-disabled people, when disabilities manifest in so many different ways, and you often won't have statistical significance in the number of candidates coming through? It's much easier to do that type of statistical analysis for gender, for example, or for race. Now, it is equally problematic, I should say, for non-binary individuals or transgender individuals, for people of mixed race, but at least in the gender and racial diversity categories, we have more established categories and larger, typically larger sample sizes that are easier to study. So there's this real problem around auditing for bias on disability. The reason why that matters for all of us, as I said, is that a lot of vendors are out there at conferences, and I go there to these employment conferences, marketing their tools, saying that they have screened for bias, but they're not thinking about disability when they make those pronouncements, and that's hugely problematic from an inclusion perspective. I'll end on this last big point, which ties to that, which is just as a general matter, I'm so thrilled that this conversation is happening in this workshop because disability is far too often excluded from discussions of algorithmic bias. We very frequently have seen this wonderful emergence of a conversation around algorithmic fairness, but it is still easier for people to jump to think about racial diversity and gender diversity, both very, very important, but not add in the additional ways in which people could be marginalized, and particularly when people oversect within those categories to be multiply marginalized. So it's an essential part of our program that we need to think about those crossover issues. And the final point is that it needs to, I think we need a lot more effort to think about how we move outside the bubble of policy advocates and academics that are talking about these issues to reach the decision makers that are driving the market to create these tools and to deploy them. So we need to be out talking to employers, talking to vendors, and trying to make smarter decision makers throughout that process, underscoring the ethical, business, and legal imperatives for change. Those are some of my opening thoughts. I'm thrilled to be here with you. And Julia, I'll pass it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alexandra. This is a perfect segue. And I cannot start my video for some. I'm thrilled to be here. My name is Julia Stojanovic. I'm an assistant professor of computer science and engineering and of data science at New York University. And I also co-direct the newly established Center for Responsible AI at NYU. Today, it is my pleasure to speak with you about the responsible design, development, and use of algorithmic systems, particularly as they pertain to hiring, employment, and the future of work, and particularly, of course, as they pertain to the community of individuals with disabilities. I have to say that I am humbled to be speaking in front of this audience, both because of the amazing strengths and creativity that members of this community have been exhibiting and resilience, and also because this is my first time speaking to a group of individuals that includes individuals with disabilities. So I ask you in advance to please forgive me if I use incorrect terminology or if my presentation methodology or speed is inappropriate, and I would love for you to correct me, to give me feedback so that I can become one of the advocates for this community in a thoughtful way. Now, if I can just figure out how to advance slides. So our topic today is, of course, the future of work, and automated hiring systems do make a prominent portion of that topic, as Alexandra already discussed with all of us. Part of the discussion focuses on the use of technology for hiring, but I want to be sure that towards the end of my presentation and also during questions and answers, we get to other topics that involve technology and this community and employment and the future of work. Things don't stop at hiring. So to recap some of the things that Alexandra already said, in a recent report from Upturn, the hiring process is described as a funnel. It's a sequence of steps in which a series of decisions lead to job offers to some individuals and rejections to others. This process starts when employers source candidates by ads or job postings. So what I'm showing on this slide is a depiction of this funnel with the different stages shown pictorially. And I also, before I dive in, I guess I should say that many of the images here, the majority of the images, come from a scientific comic that I created together with the amazing Fala Arif Khan. This comic is available online and it's accessible through a screen reader. It's currently released in English and it will be also released in Spanish and will also be accessible in Spanish this week. So if you can't see some of these images today, you can look at them later with annotations in the comic book. So this funnel that I'm depicting is made up of a sequence of steps. These are sourcing of candidates by ads or job postings. The next stage typically is called screening, where employers assess candidates by analyzing their experience, skills, and characteristics. Next, through interviewing, employers continue their assessment more directly. After that, background checks may follow. And then during the selection step, employers make final hiring and compensation determinations. Importantly, data and predictive analytics are used during all of these stages. As stated by Jenny Yang, former commissioner of the US Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, or EEOC, automated hiring systems act as modern gatekeepers to economic opportunity. And now, of course, we have some bad news, and Alexandra already spoke about things that can go wrong in quite some detail. So I will just recap very quickly here that we have been seeing cases of discrimination based on gender, on race, and on disability status at all stages of this pipeline. The kinds of concerns that we are faced with the use of these automated hiring tools pertain to unfairness in the decisions that are made by these systems, which we would denote as discrimination, or by the unfairness in the process by which these decisions are made. And these I would call due process violations or due process concerns. Very often, discrimination and due process violations are linked to the term bias. This is a term that some of you already started discussing in chat and that we will revisit momentarily. There is also concern, before we dive into bias, about whether these tools actually work. So what I'm showing here on this slide is a depiction of Arvind Narayanan. He is a computer science professor at Princeton who has a wonderful talk about spotting AI snake oil. So are these tools actually working? Are they picking up useful signal from the data, or are they an elaborate coin flip at best? As Arvind Narayanan puts it, are these tools AI snake oil? In the complex ecosystem in which automated hiring tools are commissioned, developed, and used, we must ask ourselves, who is responsible for ensuring that these tools are built and used appropriately? Who is responsible for catching and mitigating discrimination and due process violations, and for controlling the proliferation of AI snake oil under the fancy label of data science and AI. And what I'm showing here in support of this narrative is a culpability lineup in which the point that I'm making is that everybody is responsible. Scientists are responsible, members of the public, platforms, software developers, all of us are responsible for making sure that these tools are used to benefit society and not harm individuals or particular groups, such as individuals with disabilities. The hiring funnel, as well as each component of the funnel, are examples of automated decision systems, or ADS. These systems process data about people, some of which may be sensitive or proprietary. They help make decisions that are consequential to people's lives and livelihoods. They involve a combination of human and automated decision-making. They are designed with the stated goals of improving efficiency and promoting, or at least not hindering, equitable access to opportunity. And finally, they are subject to auditing for legal compliance and at least potentially to public disclosure. ADS, automated hiring decision systems, may or may not use AI, although most of them are built as AI because AI sells. And they may or may not have autonomy, meaning that they may not be making these decisions entirely on their own. Usually there is also a human decision maker in the mix, but they all rely heavily on data. And so what I would like for us to focus on is the role of data in this environment. In response to the question about responsibility, we've been seeing attempts to regulate the use of data-driven algorithmic tools, such as those that make part of the hiring funnel. This activity is broader in scope than algorithmic hiring, of course, and it pertains to automated decision systems more generally, the systems that I described previously. A big question here is, how might we go about regulating these systems? How might we go about regulating ADS? And should we even attempt to do this? And while the predominant sentiment in the industry is still that regulation will stifle innovation, I'm showing here a reckless child on a bicycle, not hitting the brakes. Industry alone doesn't get to decide. And even in the Silicon Valley, the need for meaningful regulation to ease compliance and to limit liability is starting to be more and more broadly recognized. There's much debate on a specific regulatory framework that we should adopt. Should we use precautionary principles that can be summarized as better safe than sorry? And here I'm showing an image of a child on a bicycle in protective gear. Or more likely, attempt a more agile, risk-based method, such as algorithmic impact assessment. And here I'm showing a picture of a child who is riding a bicycle carefully with a helmet. All this and more is the subject of intense debate, some of which I had a chance to witness firsthand and in which I am still actively participating. New York City, where I live, recently made a very public commitment to opening the black box of New York City government's use of technology. In May 2018, an automated decision systems task force was convened, the first such in the United States, and charged with providing recommendations to New York City's agencies about becoming transparent and accountable in their use of ADS. And I was a member of this task force by appointment from the New York City mayor. The task force issued a report that included a set of principles. These principles say that we should be using ADS only if they promote innovation and efficiency in service delivery, not simply because they are available, not simply because they're being sold to us as this AI snake oil. We should also be promoting fairness, equity, accountability, and transparency in the use of ADS. And finally, we need to be thinking about how to reduce potential harm across the entire lifespan of ADS, starting from its design and all the way through deployment. And while making important points in this report, the ADS task force unfortunately didn't go very far in terms of concrete recommendations. And I'm happy to discuss the reasons for this offline. I can spend hours talking about what went right and what went wrong during our deliberations. But we also have an immediate opportunity to make things a lot more concrete in the context specifically of regulating hiring systems in New York. There's currently a proposed law, a bill, that is being considered by the New York City Council's Committee on Technology. There was a hearing on this bill just this past Friday. This bill would regulate the use of automated employment decision tools with the help of a bias audit, as well as public disclosure. Individuals being evaluated with the help of algorithmic tools would have the right to know that an algorithm rather than a person was used to screen them. And most importantly, in my mind, individuals would also be told what job qualifications or characteristics were used by the tool. And ideally, we would also want to make sure that the job relevance of these qualifications is substantiated. So let me now switch gears and talk about the things that I was asked to discuss. And that is, what is this bias in the data? What are some of the technical interventions, some of the technical solutions that we may want to use here? And to start, I want us to step back and think carefully about the role of technological interventions, such as data and model debiasing that you may have heard about. This discussion is necessary to help us find a pragmatic middle ground between two harmful extremes. One of these is techno-optimism. So what I'm depicting here is an image of a woman with dark sunglasses. And in these sunglasses, there's a reflection. On the left, I am reflecting one harmful extreme, and that is techno-optimism, a belief that technology can single-handedly fix deep-seated societal problems, like structural discrimination in hiring. And on the right, I'm showing an image that illustrates techno-bashing. And that is a belief that any attempt to operationalize legal compliance and ethics in technology will amount to fair washing, and so should be dismissed outright. And so our job, I think, is to really find a way to navigate between these extremes to create a nuanced understanding of the role of technology in society. So let's get back to bias, a term that is used very often these days to explain what's wrong with automated decision systems, but that remains poorly understood. What do we mean by bias? Our meaning of this term is not in the traditional sense that is used by statisticians, who say that a model may be biased if it does not summarize the data correctly. Instead, what we are seeing here are examples of societal bias exhibiting itself in the data. Let's unpack that further. Data is an image of the world. It's mirror reflection. When we think about societal bias in the data, we interrogate this reflection. And this is what I'm depicting here, a world on the left that we don't quite know. And then there's a person that is looking at this world through a mirror, through a lens. One interpretation of bias in the data is that this reflection is distorted. We may systematically oversample or undersample, overrepresent or underrepresent particular parts of the world, or we may otherwise distort the readings. It is important to keep in mind that a reflection cannot know whether it's distorted. In other words, data alone cannot tell us whether it is a distorted reflection of a perfect world, a perfect reflection of a distorted world, or if these distortions compound. The assumed or externally verified nature of distortions has to be explicitly stated. Another interpretation of bias in the data that I'm showing on the right of this slide is that even if we were able to reflect the world perfectly in the data, even if we were able to take a perfect measurement of the world such as it is, it would still be a measurement of the world such as it is, or such as it has been historically, and not as it could or should be. And once again, importantly, it's not up to data or algorithms, but rather up to people, individuals, groups, and society at large to come to consensus about whether the world is how it should be, or if it needs to be improved, and if so, how we should go about improving it. My final point on this metaphor is that changing the reflection does not necessarily change the world. If the reflection itself is used to make important decisions, for example, whom to hire or what salary to offer to an individual being hired, then compensating for the distortions is worthwhile. But the mirror metaphor only takes us so far. We have to work much harder, usually going far beyond purely technological solutions, to propagate the changes back into the world, not merely brush up the reflection. One way to conceptualize automated decision systems is simply as a so-called predictive analytic that takes as input a nice, clean, rectangular data set that I'm depicting here. It crunches it, and then it produces a result. And this result could, for example, be a prediction of how likely somebody is to do well on a job, and so therefore whether we should be hiring them. If we then notice that the result is such that no women are shown ads for high-paying jobs, for example, and no individuals with disabilities pass an online job interview, then we have three choices if this is our worldview. And these are that we could tweak the input data, for example, upsample or downsample some groups. We could tweak the algorithmic box that crunches this data, or we could change the result. For example, we could reassign outcomes. However, an issue here is that this particular view is a frog's eye view. I argue that we need to expand the scope and also think what specifically happens inside this box that crunches the data. Think how the results are being used, whom are they impacting, who benefits and who is harmed. And also, we need to ask ourselves, where did the data come from? In other words, we will gain much more power to incorporate responsibility into automated decision systems development and use if we see these systems through the lens of their development, design, and deployment lifecycle and their data lifecycle. In their seminal 1996 paper, Friedman and Nissenbaum identified 3 types of bias that can arise in computer systems with a broader view of these systems. This bias is represented here as a 3-headed dragon: pre-existing, technical, and emergent. Pre-existing bias exists independently of an algorithm itself. It has its origins in society. This is the societal bias that we have been discussing with the mirror metaphor. Technical bias can be introduced at any stage of the system's life cycle, and it may exacerbate pre-existing bias. I will give a couple of examples next. And finally, emergent bias arises in the context of use, and it may be present if a system was designed with different users in mind or when societal concepts shift over time. In hiring, a prominent example of this is rich get richer. Emergent bias arises because decision makers, hiring managers in this case, tend to trust the algorithmic system to indeed select the most suitable candidates. For example, by placing them at top positions of a ranked list. And this in turn is going to shape a hiring manager's idea of what a suitable candidate looks like. So to discuss technical bias a bit more, let us look for about a minute at models and assumptions. Technical bias often has its origin in incorrect modeling assumptions or in technical choices that follow from these assumptions. So here are some concrete examples. And what I'm depicting here is an art gallery in which there are 4 paintings of apples. One is a realistic one, and 3 are abstract to different levels of abstraction. So suppose that a job applicant applies through an online form, and that this form allows applicants to leave their age unspecified. This data will travel through multiple data processing steps before it's given as input to a predictive analytic, a classifier that will decide whom to invite for job interviews. Further, to make a prediction, the classifier will need to know what the value of age is. So if that value was unspecified, it will try to guess it, to interpolate it, to fill in the blank. Now the question is, how should the system guess someone's age? And the most common method for this is the simplest one. It's called mode imputation, replacing a missing value with the most frequent value for the feature. If age is missing at random, meaning that everybody is equally as likely to not specify their age, then this method is appropriate. But if age is missing more frequently for older individuals, for example, because they may fear age discrimination in employment, then mode imputation will impute age for them incorrectly, and systematically so. Next, consider a form, an online form, that gives job applicants—
Excuse me, there's no more interpreter.
Oh.
Yes, now Delilah is there. I can see her.
Yeah, we're having problems with my system here at home.
I can also give a transcript, a written transcript of this, if that's helpful. I suppose we should have done that ahead of time.
So, Kylie, are you able to see Delilah now?
We can see Delilah.
And I'm over time, probably. Am I?
You're certainly getting close, but it's so interesting. I've been loath to to ask you to wrap it up. But if do you feel you have how many more to go?
I can wrap up in about a minute. I do want to talk about the models and assumptions because this is something that people don't think about very often.
I think, and it's okay. It means I sacrifice some of my conversation with you, but that's all right. We have questions to go to after. Let's go ahead and keep going, please. I think that people are really benefiting from your presentation.
So I'll do my best to finish in 2 minutes or so, and apologies.
Please don't rush, just go ahead.
Okay, so restarting with the Apple gallery, right? So we talked about modeling assumptions actually being extremely important. And we said that if you guess a person's age or an age of a demographic group systematically incorrectly, then this is problematic. And it's based on some assumptions you're making about your data. Now, the next example I was going to give is a form that gives job applicants a binary choice of gender, but also allows them to leave gender unspecified. And suppose that about half of the users, of the applicants, identify as men and half as women, but that women are more likely to omit gender, once again, because they fear discrimination, perhaps. Then, if replacing a missing value with the most common value for that attribute, for gender, is used, then all predominantly female unspecified gender values will be set to male. More generally, multi-class classification for guessing values, missing values, for missing value imputation, typically only uses the most frequent classes as target variables, leading to a distortion for small population groups, because membership in these groups will never be imputed. Next, suppose that some individuals identify as non-binary. Because the system only supports male, female, and unspecified as options, these individuals will likely leave their gender unspecified. And then once again, the system will use mode imputation, and it will set their gender to some value, probably male, because this is a predominantly male data set. A more sophisticated imputation methods exists, right? And it could be used and it could do better, but it will still use values from the active domain of the feature, as we say, meaning that it will still set the value to either male or female. This example illustrates that technical bias can arise from an incomplete or incorrect choice of data representation. And finally, consider a form that has home address as a field, and a homeless person may leave this value unspecified, and it would be incorrect to impute it. We would lose information. While dealing with blank null values is known to be difficult and is already considered among the issues in data cleaning, that this is a technical discipline that thinks about these questions, the needs of responsible data science introduce new problems here with much higher stakes. Importantly, it's been documented that data quality issues, including missing values, often disproportionately affect members of historically disadvantaged groups, such as individuals with disabilities. And so this is a risk that we see here of technical bias exacerbating pre-existing bias for such groups. And there are, of course, immediate parallels here for individuals with disabilities, of their data being missing in a way that is non-random, and imputation potentially being harmful if it's not done thoughtfully. I'm going to skip this. This is a framing that I like that talks about all of these problems under the lens of data equity: representation, feature, outcome, and access. But what I want to stress is that rather than focusing on the use of AI, artificial intelligence, and automated decision systems for hiring and screening, we should instead shift our focus to how we can use AI to solve problems that create opportunities for all of us. Rather than developing platforms that encode in hospitality, a term due to Chansey Fleet, we should be thinking about how to use AI to improve accessibility. Rather than ghostwriting code, again, a term due to Chansey, that enables accessibility, what about making writing that code part of a toolkit that has our priority, to which we pay particular attention? What about developing AI methods that are specifically working for individuals with disabilities? I'm showing here a picture of Chansey Fleet and a quote from one of her talks. And I'm going to skip this. This is a picture that illustrates how individuals with disabilities can be seen with even more errors by facial recognition software, which frankly, we are in more trouble if that software works than if it doesn't. So my takeaways are that we should be thinking about how to build systems, technological systems, that are rooted in the needs of people. And this means that we need to expose the knobs of responsibility to people. And we must work together to create meaningful regulatory mechanisms and also engage in educational activities. And these are the goals of the Center for Responsible AI at NYU that I am starting together with colleagues and friends. An example of an ongoing educational activity is a series of workshops that will culminate in a course for members of the public on the use of algorithms in general, and specifically on their use in hiring and employment. We're doing this together with the Queens Public Library in New York City as a pilot, and will then scale up through libraries in the US. And another example is a comic series of which we have released the first volume called Mirror Mirror, together with a very talented Fala Arif Khan, who I think participated in an earlier workshop that is part of this series. So please take a look at the comic, let us know what you think. And the final anecdote with which I will leave you is I already mentioned that the comic is accessible. You can read it with a screen reader. And the only way that we were able to make this work is by getting feedback from Chansey Fleet. She helped us debug it. And of course, that method doesn't scale. So another opportunity for using AI is to help us make educational materials accessible, including also on AI itself. So I'll just stop here and I'm happy to continue the discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Alexandra. That was two really, really terrific presentations. And I really felt that I was learning so much. And I could tell that I was keeping an eye on the chat throughout both of your talks. And I can see that people were quite engaged and had some really important questions to ask. So, you know, I think that one of the really difficult challenges with AI is that notion of that sort of that black box and understanding how we can sort of get in it and get at it and write policies related to it. And I felt that you both really helped to open that up for me a little bit today. Alexandra, when you were talking about policy, particularly with regards to the ADA, I was trying to think about how that's playing out in Canada and other jurisdictions. And I wondered, have you had opportunity yet to focus on any other jurisdictions in terms of regulatory structures around or protections around the use of automated data systems, decision-making systems in hiring processes or other areas? I thought it was well laid out in Title I and in the ADA. And we have similar human rights codes here in Canada that protect against discrimination. But I wondered, is that something that you've seen any other areas where they've got some novel approaches to policy?
Sure. I felt self-conscious joining that workshop, this workshop, when I don't have familiarity with Canadian law. So you have to excuse me with my US focus. We are spending a lot of time in Europe as well. So there, the European Commission is focused on questions of AI and equity and bias. And the European Union moves slowly but steadily when they decide to regulate a space. And we saw that with their general data protection regulation, which was like a slow-moving glacier, but did end up having a significant impact on privacy policies around the world. They have some provisions on AI in that bill, and they're now considering a new initiative around AI as well. Part of the problem, though, is that a lot of these regulatory regimes are still just focused only on transparency and putting the burden on the user. And there was some comments about this in the chat. Mm-hmm. In my mind, that is asking way too much of all of us as individuals to know how we might be discriminated against and be able to take individual actions. And so that's why we've been focused so much on trying to get directly to employers to know, here's the legal framework, here's how you might be violating the law, but also just here from a moral and ethical perspective is why you need to focus on these things. The last piece I'll say is Christopher had some excellent comments in the chat about how even in the US, right, that language in the Americans with Disabilities Act is really, really good. I would argue it's basically undiscovered so far as it comes to AI, because nobody is actually litigating these cases. The Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law did bring a series of challenges in the early 2000s around the use of personality tests. And they filed complaints with the EEOC and fought for years. And even there, they had a really hard time moving the needle, despite the good language on the books. So that tells me a couple things. One, we need to keep stepping up our advocacy and our pressure. Two, we do need to look at this legal framework and see what else we could be doing. So there's a new administration coming in the United States. Could that new administration issue new guidance from our Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to say, actually, this is indeed a violation of federal law, and lean in far more aggressively to help set expectations around what is acceptable testing and what is not?
Thank you. And it's so interesting for us to hear about what is happening elsewhere, including and really don't feel self-conscious about having an American focus. We're well aware of that, of where you're coming from when we invited you to be here. And we're interested in what's happening and other approaches from other jurisdictions, in part because we are wanting to consider what might be some possible approaches within our study group here today. So getting a variety of information is really quite helpful to us in this. And
If
Julie,
I just may add to
yes,
this.
Julie, I was going to ask.
We actually are looking to Canada also for some help and some guidance on this. So I pasted into chat a link to the Canadian Federal Directive on Automated Decision Making. We don't have such a directive in the United States. It takes an approach to regulation. This is the use of these tools within the Canadian government, not more broadly, right? So
Right.
regulating the hiring ecosystem is out of scope. But the approach that they take is based on impact assessment, which in my mind is the right way to go here. So understanding what are the harms, the potential harms, what are the benefits, and to whom are these the harms and the benefits. One thing that is still lacking, even if you pass regulation of this sort, is that you must have an informed public. And I think that this is really where the rubber hits the road. We all need to think very carefully, and none of us know how to do this, not in Europe, not in New Zealand, not in Canada, not in the US, how to actually create even a basic level of understanding of data algorithms and what we should be asking of algorithms and of data. So this is my 2 cents as a technologist. I think that technology is the easy part here, relatively speaking.
Yeah.
It's really educating people.
I was fascinated when you were talking about the notion of whether it's a distortion of a perfect world, a reflection of a distorted world, and these different ways of that, you know, understanding the data. And I think that there was a lot that was very interesting and gave me new ways to think about this whole process. And I will say, you know, it struck me, I think, Alexandra, you were the one that were talking about the idea that really when these systems are being used, for example, in the hiring process, that there should be disclosure that we are, you know, being sort of put to the test or put through certain systems. And I know even for myself, when I've looked at some processes, I've wondered, you know, are there hidden buzzwords I should be hiding, you know, in white font in my resume or my CV, or if I'm helping someone, I'm wondering if that's something they should do. And so there are these hurdles that are there that many of us aren't aware of, no matter who is looking for the job. And I can certainly see how that idea that this should be disclosed is I think might be novel to some employers who sort of like the shield of these systems between them and the hiring process, them and the candidate. And then, of course, I think some people quite maybe without intending to think that because it's a data system that it will not have bias, that it's going to be unbiased because there's no human in it to bias it. But of course, one of the things we're learning and are just exploring is the fact that bias is inherent in the systems because it's built by biased people and by biased data. And so addressing that is really, and the solutions that you were suggesting, Julia, were really fascinating to me. I think I'm going to try to talk less. Sibel, you had quite a number of questions. Why don't you choose one of your favorites to start with, and we can come back to you again after a couple others if we have opportunity.
Great. I'll just say one question, and then I just have a couple like points I'll leave in case you happen to address them or not. So the question is around the disclosure piece. So I wrote, how do we monitor for discrimination based on disability when disclosure should be optional and discrimination based on disability should not be predicated on required disclosure? So that's a primary question I want to ask. I'm also kind of curious to know if there are easy flags to watch for discriminatory algorithms. For example, if gaps in job history, for example, could be a bad thing that screeners are used to look for, or if there are really good flags, like are they looking for the benefits of lived experience? Sort of easy ways to be able to tell who's likely to be a real problem versus somebody who's really good. So I guess that's 2 questions.
So Val, they're really good ones and ones that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about. Because again, in theory, the Americans with Disabilities Act helps on this, right? Your request for an accommodation cannot be used against you. But then we have to dovetail that reality of the legal framework and people's actual experience and their level of comfort asking for an accommodation and realize just how challenging that is. A system that requires disclosure in order to be fair is really an unfortunate one, and one that I think makes this quite challenging. For the reasons I mentioned in my talk, it also makes the data collection piece really hard, right? Even if you wanted to come in as a good faith researcher and kind of audit from behind how a sample of employees did, you could maybe make inferences about gender or race based on what you know about a person and do a loose assessment, at least, of how the people tend to be trending from a risk of discrimination on those vectors. Disability, much harder. There it really does need self-disclosure for people to know, for auditing purposes, kind of how you were treated. We've been having some conversations about whether there are creative solutions here. Could we have a co-op of disabled people who voluntarily agree that they're going to, share their data with a trusted third-party nonprofit and then go out and apply for jobs and see how they're doing? But the mechanism of that, it would need a lot of working out, right? There are concerns about that too. I'm a privacy lawyer in addition to thinking about fairness. And so, but I do wonder some of those things. I almost wish that LinkedIn had a way of you kind of opting into a voluntary program where you could reveal your protected characteristics just for purposes of trusted auditing. Like the employer wouldn't see them, but a trusted auditor would. So anyway, that's one of the thoughts that I have at night thinking about that question, but I think we need smart minds really coming together on that point. As for the flags, I think what we really need, this is why we need to know better what people are being evaluated on so that you can look to think through what the flags are going to be, right? Gaps in a resume might be one obvious one, but there may be many other ways that a system may discriminate against a particular person with a disability based on their individual circumstances that just the data scientists ex ante can't even think about or contemplate to know about a potential risk. So I flagged in my talk some of the most obvious ones that jump to me. I try to spend a lot of time cataloging these from talking to folks who are experiencing some of these tools. But it needs to be an ongoing project, again, because of the sheer diversity of experiences that people will have when interacting with these tools.
And if I may add to this from kind of a technological point of view, I absolutely agree with everything you said, Alexandra. And there are actually technical methods that can help us support these types of auditing, as well as these types of public disclosure, right? So when we talk about auditing, it doesn't have to be us measuring performance of a system on the data, the live data on which it's deployed. We have methods to generate data synthetically or semi-synthetically that resembles the kind of a population that we want, on which we want to interrogate the behavior of the system. So that technology is there. It can give us privacy protection, and it can allow us to work with these machines to try and test them until we are satisfied with their performance along all of these dimensions. And I also want to add that in addition to biased data and biased people, an important dimension here is that the criteria of goodness against which we evaluate these systems can be biased as well, because there is no such thing as absolute perfect accuracy, right? If you're accurate for one group, you may be less accurate for another. So who decides on that trade-off? And who decides what accuracy means, what fairness means technically, right? So that's kind of another dimension there. But then also in terms of job relevance, right? I think that that's crucial, right? It's not enough for us to just say, the reason you were selected for this job is because your name is Jared and you played lacrosse. This may in fact be, and this is an anecdote that's well known, the signal that the system picked up. But if we know that this is the signal that the system picked up, we should immediately challenge it. Right? And so what I think is a promising metaphor here technically, so for auditing, we had synthetic data sets, but for understanding which features are job relevant and which features we think are okay to use is this metaphor of a nutritional label that I've been running with. So when you explain to a particular job applicant how a decision was made that affects them, you can tell them it's because your speed of discriminating between the red and the green circles was lower than what I expected. And then that individual would know that this actually is because of a particular disability that they're living with. And then they can challenge that decision. So I think we need, in addition to this kind of auditing that talks about the behavior of an algorithm in bulk over an entire population, very powerful mechanisms to explain to individuals what happened, who can then challenge these decisions.
Julia, I love that. And one point I would add that complicates these is that for many of the tools, the value they're selling is that they may not actually know what characteristics they're evaluating for. They're studying trends in an existing pool of employees who are doing well, and then saying, well, they play this game this way. And so we're going to find you people that play the game the same way. And they may well not be able to articulate the specific job characteristics that are actually making these people look like winners. And so our method, right, what we're saying is let's challenge that and say, no, you have to be able to articulate what attributes you are valuing and at what rate you are evaluating them, so we can see whether those are tied to the essential function of the job. The problem is that actually cuts right to the business proposition of why we need this magic AI, the snake oil, to be doing that inference for us, right? And so that's going to be a struggle with the industry that we need to keep pushing for.
But we absolutely must. And if we don't do this now, it may already be too late, in fact, right? But if the longer we wait, the closer we will be to the state that we're in with regulating our inability to regulate social networks, for example, and the kinds of effects that we're seeing there, that the only way to cancel these effects really is to dismantle the business models of advertisement targeting in that case, right? That also hits us here as well, because ad targeting for jobs is part of this funnel for hiring.
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions from, I'm just looking for any raised hands. Just want to give people a moment to find that. This is the time to disrupt the system. Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. So Janet has put a question up.
I have a question. Yes, and so I think others have heard me speak about this before. In one way or another, we've had education at some level. Can you hear me?
You know, Janet, there's a little bit of
Yes,
distortion,
okay.
but we are hearing you.
So, okay, so I will speak slowly. How about people with disabilities who want the nature of their disability or their social, economical identities, the location, their poverty even, may not necessarily qualify to apply for the jobs that show up in highly technical apps or systems or platforms, right? I'm thinking, I know folks with disabilities with Down syndrome, and they work at team research focus on the folks who are not as educated, who are a lot less disadvantaged than us here in this very privileged circle.
Thank you so much for that point. I have two thoughts to add, and other workshop members, curious if they have thoughts. One is, just as a matter of course in our advocacy materials, we are now creating plain language versions of everything we write and know your rights versions of documents to help empower people to better understand these issues. Julia, I love that you have a comic book. That's another way of trying to make these issues accessible. Ours are literally a single piece of paper that just try to spell out very simply how these systems might affect you and what you can do about it. The other point I heard in your question is realizing that a lot of these hiring tools right now are being used more for white collar jobs, we would say. And so what do we think about other aspects of the workforce? One is that the personality tests that I mentioned are being used very widely. So they're being used in many retail jobs in particular, your Walmarts, CVS, Best Buy, Target, are using those types of tests and have actually taken some steps in response to accusations of bias that come from those personality tests. So that's one area where we do need to be vigilant. The other is that we need to think about the use of AI, not just in hiring, but what it means to be a worker that is subject to surveillance, whose performance is being measured by tools. There has been very good research done about what this means for truckers, for example, long distance truckers who now are some of the most surveilled workers in the country, with machines looking at their eye contact and where their eyes are looking. For people that work in, the Amazon warehouses, for example, Uber drivers, there are many examples of the quantified worker and what it means to have your movements tracked, and not only tracked, but evaluated against peers, and you rise or fall based on how you're doing compared to that large data set of others. What that means for human dignity, what it means for fairness in how you're evaluated and judged. So that's another big piece of the puzzle that I think the conversation needs to go to next.
Yes, in fact, I was thinking, we tend to look at the hiring process often, but the whole employment cycle, which both of you spoke about, is also that area that we need to consider and focus. And the surveillance aspect that you've talked about, which is creating other data sets, and maybe it's also information that's being collected about one aspect of your performance or what you're doing, but then maybe used in other ways, which is usually an ethical no-no, right? To collect data for one purpose and then use it for other purposes is not usually okay. Oh, EEOC, that's your employment equity. Someone wants to know what that means.
Yeah, it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Thank you very much.
Where Jenny Yang was commissioner under Obama, and we hope that she will now become active again in some capacity. Yeah.
We are awaiting with bated breath to see how things will resolve in your country for your next administration.
Right. If I may just add one more very quick point on the discussion before, and that is with the final point with my mirror metaphor is that you can't just touch up the reflection, right? It does help to hire people who are qualified for the job, despite them maybe looking not as good on paper. But it's also not enough for us to actually be mitigating at various steps of the hiring funnel, or generally at the level of this hiring funnel is not enough. What we need to do is to use AI and just, our human personal thinking in figuring out how to make it so that people from the disabilities community, those who are severely disabled, learn the skills that are necessary to enter the job market. And for this, AI can and should help. And so I think that the future of work in this AI context is not how do we make it so that we can use AI to hire fairly. Rather, it's how do we make AI serve our purposes, create new jobs for us. What are these jobs that AI can enable? How can we make AI make education more equitable?
Yes. I love the fact that you're looking at the opportunity aspect. I think that, and we try to catch ourselves as well, and not sort of always sort of assuming that all AI is somehow problematic, and for sure there's lots of challenges, but if we can harness some of the benefit, that would be really terrific. We've come to the end of our slotted time, and I know there was still some questions, and really, I think I speak for everybody here when I say we really enjoyed hearing your presentations and having the opportunity to have some questions with you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for all of the study group and our other participants who joined us today. We'll continue our discussions in Canvas and elsewhere. But you know, we always hope that we'll have an opportunity to engage with our panelists again. So Julia, Alexandra, hopefully we'll have more opportunities to share the idea around data trust, for example, is something we're exploring really deeply here at the IDRC. So, and I see so much overlap in both of your work with interests here. So we hope to see you again and collaborate further. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you. Would be delighted to work together.
And I don't know, everyone, we actually, if you have a reaction, you can put your you can put your applause in the windows. And that concludes our session. So thank you very, very much. Much appreciated everybody's participation today.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.